my name's Isabelle Pead and I'm an artist who works predominantly with sound and installation and sculpture. Mainly my practice revolves around sound and an exploration of sound. I'm really interested in looking at the voice, specifically like the female voice, and how that can interact with objects and other sounding bodies to create sort of wider scale installations, which really think about the effect of sound, how that changes mood, and how it sort of works as like this really transient and holistic ephemeral medium. I've spent a lot of time sort of in my past like working with choirs and working with like collectives that sort of utilize different aspects of sound. I have like a background in sort of classical choral and then a little bit of opera, and then I got really into like techno and electronic music, and that really inspired a lot of like my working with synthesizers. And I guess now I'm interested in how these sort of two bodies, like sounding bodies, both like the organic voice and the inorganic electronic body of a synthesizer, kind of can merge and meet and affect space, and how space can affect it. I also find it really useful to sort of ground myself in conceptual workings or in like theoretical ideas, which can then be expanded upon and sort of, I don't know, like tasty morsels that then find themselves back into my work. For example, the sound piece that I'm showing in this exhibition was made in response to an essay by Eliane Rodrigue, who's a sort of French early synth pioneer. And she wrote this imaginative essay called The Mysterious Power of the Infinitesimal, which was sort of her imagining of how sound evolved in the earth and how these sounds, they were sort of created in the earth, they were put into humans, and then humans put them into synthesizers. So sort of seeing this progression of sound not being like a polarizing of the organic body and the synthesized electronic body. They were just two things that were an evolution of one or the other, and they sort of looped back into each other. Which is what I tried to capture in this piece. So it's a sort of 18-minute long piece, which moves from just voice to voice and synthesizer to just synthesizer to voice and synthesizer to just voice, and then back around we go in this sort of like infinite giving, evolving loop, I guess. I find that I'm really research-based in a lot of my work. I definitely start from research and building concept rather than starting from a material base. I've always shaped materials to fit concept rather than the other way around. So I find materials that suit concept rather than trying to like start by saying like a singularity of a material. I guess the only exception to that would be my interest in sound. I think that always is like the underlying base. I feel like I've talked a lot about sound. There's like this material that I use constantly, but then quite a recent thing in my practice is working with aluminium and sort of understanding a whole new process of like making these big etching plates, which I think is really liberating as well as a thing, because it's sort of, and it's given me opportunity to experiment with something that I had absolutely no idea about 6 months ago, and now I was like quite boldly or maybe a bit stupidly making things which were absolutely massive, but just really enjoying the process. And I think there's something really to be said about just enjoying the process of material making. And it's something I often stop myself from doing, but when I get into it, I really love it. And I also really like the impact that these objects and this material has almost in like a reflexive way. So it's something that I started working with out of a practical reason, and then after that found, I don't know, like a real conceptual gravity that it held within my work. Like thinking about aluminium as this like etched surface which held mark and grain in the same way that like a vinyl is an etched surface in audio recording. I kind of really like that that resonance between objects which like pertain to sound or pertain to the memory of sound, but they can hold that meaning in quite like a subtle way. And I like having them in the space with the sound, sort of to reflect one another or to like draw a connection between them. It's these objects coming together to create something that is a bit greater than just these individual things. I never really think of my work as being sort of individual pieces in isolation. There's always a conversation that's happening between them, often between audio and then between like the space as a whole. And I think that can be something that I strive for, sort of like some sort of fulfillment of the space and fulfillment of experience. I really care a lot about engagement with the work and how people engage, but also how they then become part of it. I've often been, a huge inspiration for my work is Pauline Oliveros and deep listening practices. And this role of the audience as listeners, it places them within the work. They are always like implicated within the work, and then they become part of it and it expands it. And it's a perpetual process of listening and understanding. So it's not just me as like maker, it's also them as listeners, which I think is really important. And I think there is something fulfilling in that process, because it never feels like the work ends or it comes to a stop. There's not a sort of like, this is it, and then it stops here, because these works, like the minute that sound moves into a different space, the minute it's in here, the minute it's in a different space, it's got different acoustics, the concrete of here creates this echo, which is wonderful, and adds its own tone and grain and timbre, and it continues to evolve, it continues to add aspect to it, which is pretty vital in sort of the installation of sound. Like everyone has some kind of interaction with sound. It's such like an ephemeral medium that it touches everyone in a little way, but it's really, really hard to grasp onto. And so just like trying to work with it and trying to battle with it, I think is, I think that's where my sort of like excitement with like the future of this is. It's why I always sort of start with sound, because it's something that always I can return to constantly, and there's something new there, and it can bring together like different elements of society into this sort of like weird mishmash. It's constantly like changing and in flux, and it encompasses like time and memory and all of these other aspects. I think that's at least my like pursuit of pleasure is like through sonic means, whatever that might be.